So now it's time to mix a track from start to finish. The first thing we're going to do is look over the template we're going to be working with. As you can see here, we've got some output buses set up, drums, bass, vocals, 3 instruments, some effects, and then a group VCA. The point for this group VCA is to give me the option to have a relative balance for each of my output groups, but then still have an overall balance for all of them with a VCA. I'll show how this can be useful once we start getting into the mix. After our output VCAs, we've got our send effects. I've got 2 reverbs, 2 delays, a New York parallel bus with some compression on it, and then a chorus bus. So just to add some sort of modulation as a send. All of these are then fed into this sends bus, which gives me an overall volume for them. This one, however, is not set up as a VCA. If you move further to the right, you can see I've got 4 separate mixes here. These are our summing stacks. This is where most of the processing is going to happen within our template. Our drums are going to go to mix A, our bass is going to go to mix B, vocals to mix C, and all instrumentation to mix D. You can see this represented here from each of the group's output settings. Lastly, we have a sum VCA. This does exactly the same task as our group VCA. I can get a relative volume for each of our mixes independently, but then have an overall volume of which I would then send to my submix. On the submix, we have a limiter. This isn't doing anything. This is purely there as a safety net. And again, later on, I'll show how I use this to send a limited reference for mastering. Lastly, on our main out, I have my metering plugin. This is going to give me all the information I need about the track, whether it's the peak volume, the RMS, the LUFS, the total dynamic range, the stereo information, the phase correlation, and the frequency content. So let's start this mix. I'm going to flip the screen and add in the stems that I've been sent. From these stems, I'm going to select all stems, convert them all, and then drag them over into the session. It's going to ask me where I want them to go. It's going to send them to the audio files, which is correct. Let's press OK and wait for this to happen. Along with these files, there was some mix notes that were sent. So while these tracks are being imported, let's have a read of those notes. I've provided all stems dry with no effects other than those needed for the sounds themselves. I'd like you to add your own reverbs and delays where you see fit in order to create an ambient, liquid drum and bass mix that sounds warm. This sentence here is extremely important, and this is probably what I'm going to make most of the decisions off for the mix. Also, any transition effects like filtering or fading are welcome. This is also extremely important. This means I've got quite a lot of creative license to add in things to this track to make it sound how I feel is going to work. I've provided a dry reference mix for an indication as to the levels I want for the track, but other than that, I trust your decisions. So that's great. From these notes that we can see here, it gives me a really good indication of what I'm allowed to do with this mix and kind of what's expected of me as the mix engineer. Also, providing a dry reference for this mix to give me an indication of levels, this is probably the first thing I'm going to listen to once these stems get dragged in, just so I can get an idea for the sound of the track and what kind of effects and transitions I can add in to make it really pop. We can see now the audio has been imported and it's going to ask us where we want these to go. I'm going to select new tracks for this and make them start from the session start. So let's import them and see what we've got. Great, so here's all our tracks. Let's first of all try and find the reference. So here we have dry reference mix. Excellent. I'm going to drag this to the bottom of the session, put it into solo, make sure it's outputted to our correct stereo output, and have a listen to see what we can get just from the start. This is going to give us an indication as to what the track actually sounds like and an indication as to the level that the client wanted. Already I can hear that everything's quite dry, so I'm already thinking about reverbs at this point, possibly on the percussion, just to give it some atmosphere from the start.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
So the drum balance is pretty nice, the vocals are very dry, they definitely need some effects added.
I will show you the place I belong.
The instrumentation, those pianos could do with some equalization.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us. In the water, reflections of the moon.
Okay, let's listen to this transition. As we can see, it's going to move into a break.
You can follow me.
So that sort of bass sound there, looks like it's this one here, the mid bass. This could do with some width. I can see from the track that it's a mono track. So we could definitely do some work there to make that a little bit wider.
You can follow me.
Also, these percussion parts that have come in for the build-up, we did get permission to use some filtering, so this is a good place for that to happen. Some slow filter automation. And let's listen to the drop.
You can follow me.
Yeah, that bass could definitely do with being a bit wider. Let's move on slowly, just towards the end here, just to listen to those transitions.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
So I can see from the waveform the vocal is exactly the same for both sections.
Show you the place I belong.
This is probably a good place for some transitioning on the drums.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us.
I can see from the subline here that there's quite a lot of difference in the volume for each of the notes.
Reflections of the moon.
This is going to be something that we'll have to look at to get a bit more consistency in those subnotes.
You can follow me.
These strings that have been added in here could definitely do with some work.
You can follow me.
Okay, let's move on to the last section.
You can follow me.
Okay, let's see at the very end, just see how the track ends. Okay, so we've got an idea for the sound of the track. I can see here from the mix that it's a really nice level for a mix. We've got differences for the different sections. The intro part, the verse is a little bit quieter than the drop, so it's initially been mixed quite nicely. However, it is very dry. It could do with some width, and it could definitely do with a bit more warmth and a bit more ambience, just like the notes suggested. So right, let's get this in order. I'm going to leave this reference track at the bottom of the session, but all other tracks I'm going to drag up to the top above all of my output tracks. Now it's time to put all elements in their own specific groups. So let's start with drums. First of all, we'll find the obvious ones. So claps, hats, fast hat, filtered break, kick, open hat, 2 percussion tracks, rims, snare top and snare bottom. That looks like the obvious ones. We'll drag those up to the top of the session. So now we've got all of our drums in place. There may be some other ones in here that could be considered drums. We will come back to those in a second. These are just the obvious ones. I'm going to make sure all of my drums are the same colour. So all of the tracks themselves are red. I'm going to select all the clips within those tracks and make those red as well. Now I'm going to take all of these tracks and output them, first of all, to my stereo out. This is just so I can solo them and hear exactly what each part is. For instance, this crash, this could be part of our effects or it could be part of our drums. So let's have a listen and see where we're going to put this. So I think that would go more towards the effects. Let's see what boom is. Again, I'd class that as an effect. Let's keep moving through these stems. Pianos, they're obviously pianos. Sample, let's see what this is. Okay, so the sample track, let's drag this up to go with the drums. This is obviously supposed to be part of the drum break. So again, let's make this red, as well as the clips in the track. Next, we can put in order our drums. So first of all, I want to start with something that's the most important, moving all the way down to the least important. So the most important drum in this drum track is the kick. We've then got the claps and the snares. So I'm going to drag the clap next, find the snares, drag those up, find the rim shots, drag those up. Then we can move into the hi-hats. So we've got closed hat, fast hat, I'll move open hat, filtered breaks, percussions, and sample. Another way to determine what's more important other than the kicks, snares, and hats, with our breaks, we can look at what happens more often. So for instance, our percussion 2 here happens more often than percussion 1. It's up to you where you put these. I'm going to keep percussion 2 underneath the open hat because it looks like they happen at around the same time. Now I can see that all of my drums are in order. I can select all of the drum tracks and output them to a bus number. The bus I'm going to choose for this is my drum bus. I've managed to select all of them with one click here. The way I do this is by holding down Shift and Option. If I hold this down, all the tracks highlighted will then be sent to whatever track I send them to. Now because this is a drum and bass track, the next thing that's most important would be the bass. So let's find our bass tracks. We've got mid bass 2, we've got mid bass 1, and we've got sub. I'm going to drag these up just underneath the basses. We're going to give these a colour of yellow, and again all the clips within those tracks I will also make yellow. I'm going to put mid bass 1 at the top as it appears first in order. All of these while pressing Shift and Option I'm going to now send to my bass bus. Next we have boom and crash. At first listen these sounded like effects, so I'm going to drag these down to the bottom of the session where my verb clap effects are. While I'm here I might as well select them all and send them all to the effects bus. I'm going to colour these a dark colour just because I know they're not that important and they don't need to stand out so much for me. So what do we have left? We have pads main, organ, pianos, strings and vocals. Next important would be the vocals. Even though there's only one track of these, it's vocals, drums and bass that are the main focus of this track. So I'm going to colour this track pink. Make sure the clip is also the same colour as the track. And we're going to output this to our vocal bus. Next we have instrument 1. For this I'm going to pick the pianos, as these are the most dominant instrument for the track itself. I'm going to pick piano 1 as the top track. Send these both to instrument 1. And make these green. As you can see, what I'm trying to do here is create opposing colours within the session, just so each of the different elements stand out from each other. Next we have pads and strings, as these are quite dominant. So I'm going to have these sending out to instrument 2. And I'm going to give these the colour of light blue. And then we have organs last. Organs, on their own, can go to instrument 3, as they appear as the last instrument in the session. For this track, I'm going to pick orange. So, that's our session sorted out. Let's make sure that everything has an output and it's correct. All of our effects go to our effects bus. Instrument 3 for our organ. Instrument 2 for our pads and strings. Instrument 1 for our pianos. The vocals go to the vocal bus. All the basses go to the bass bus. And all of the drums are being sent to the drum bus. Let's go to the bottom of the session, make sure that our reference mix is going to the stereo out, and I'll mute this just for now. Right, this is the session organised. This is probably the most tedious part of the session. However, now everything is organised, I can switch over to my mix page and start the mix. If I listen to the track as a reference, we can see the peak volume doesn't really go above -6. Let's go to a loud part of the track, maybe the last chorus. If I play this now in solo, we'll get an indication as to how loud the mix is. We need to kind of follow this, as this was one of the notes in the mix notes.
Can follow me.
So it's between -5 and -6. If I mute this now and play the full stems, I'm probably going to get a lot louder than that. If I look at the stems themselves, they are all quite loud, especially the kicks and the snares. Having said that, they are not clipping, which means I do have some headroom in them. On listening to the reference track, you can hear that the balance of the drums is okay. So I'm going to keep this balance, but utilise my VCA fader for the groups to get a good level coming into our mixes. As I play this, it may be quite loud, but this is where our Group VCA is going to come in really handy. I'm going to keep open my metering plugin and adjust my Group VCA until I'm around that -6 to -5 area.
Can follow me. You can follow me.
I'm going to keep it about there, and we're going to go and solo the reference just to double check.
Can follow me. Can follow me.
Okay, we're getting around the same sort of loudness. Already, just using this mixing structure, the track does sound a little bit more open, and we've done no processing whatsoever. The next thing I'm going to do is look at my mixes here. In the track notes, the client mentioned that they wanted it to sound warmer. Now, I could do this on an individual basis for all of the individual stems from left to right. However, this is not CPU efficient. In order to gain an overall sound and texture and tone for the mix, I'm going to do this towards the end of the session. And this is where I'm going to take advantage of my summing stacks. Now, if I remember correctly, the drums are on mix A, the bass is on mix B, the vocals are on mix C, and the instruments are on mix D. I've still got relative volume for these, but I do have the option to mute each of them. As you can see, some of my solos here are grayed out and others aren't. The ones that are grayed out are in something called solo safe mode. This means anything sent to these can pass through if they are soloed beforehand. However, some of these are not solo safed. For this style of mix, it's good practice to have all of your possible output tracks solo safed, meaning I can go back to any one of my individual tracks on the left and solo them, and they will easily pass through their designated outputs all the way to the output fader. So let's think about getting some tone and warmth into this mix. First of all, I'm going to mute everything but the drums. Have a listen to the drums as a whole and try and determine what kind of effect we can add to these to gain some warmth. So the balance is kind of okay so far. I will go back and make some changes to the balance slightly. However, in order to get some sort of warmth into this, I think a channel strip style plugin or an emulation would work really well. One go-to channel strip that I like to use is the Neve 88RS from UAD. So let's open one of these and play around with the settings. As you can see from this plugin, it's quite comprehensive. We have an input section, we have a filter section, we have a compressor and gate section, we have a full EQ, and we have an output fader and output knob. In order to use this to gain some warmth and color, I'm going to take advantage of my input section here. As you can see, we've got a line mode and a mic mode. Switching between these two will give us some drastic differences, not in terms of level, but also in terms of the sonic characteristics. I'm going to pick mic for this and see what this sounds like. First of all, let's play it in line mode and then switch to mic just to see what the difference is. So we've obviously got a big jump in gain there. What we can do is either compensate this with a -20 dB pad, or we can use our output fader. However, whichever one we use will determine how the track will overall sound, however much we drive it by, and however much we push it by here. I'm going to put the pad in. At the moment we can hear our effects playing, so I'm just going to mute that bus quickly, just so we hear the drums. Okay, so with and without, we're going to hear a slight increase in volume, which I will try and compensate, but you'll start to hear that everything becomes a bit more saturated and a bit thicker and warmer. I'm going to take advantage of the output fader here. A bit more drive. maybe a bit too far. Compensate with our output. See that subtle difference there? If I now apply this channel strip to all of our mix buses, we should then get the same characteristics across not just the drums, but the basses, the vocals, and the instruments. We can always come back and adjust these slightly, especially adding in things like EQ to each of the groups, but this is a good starting point. So what I'm going to do is select this and copy and paste it over to every mix bus track. This is now basically emulating a mixing desk type scenario. We have some input gain drive. We're adjusting the faders. I also have my overall output faders here, but I have an EQ, compressor, gate, and some drive for every output bus. You may be thinking, why didn't I just do these on the group tracks? This would have been ideal for the drums, bass, and vocals. However, the instruments have 3 separate outputs. This means I can save on CPU by just using one for the same idea. Another reason for doing this is that I can now bounce off a drum mix, a bass mix, a vocals mix, and an instrument mix. So I have 4 stems to send if for some reason I want a stem master. So one more time, let's have a listen to our original track. And now we can start to adjust our sum VCA in order to get the same amount of peak volume.
Can follow me. You can follow me.
Now I can think about going back to the individual tracks to create a better balance. Once again, I'm going to mute everything other than the drums. I'm going to come back to my drum balance, have a look at each of the parts, and try and get more of a focus towards the kick and the snare parts, and just get a better overall feel for these drums. First of all, I'm going to bring down this sample. I'm going to come to my drum output, lower it a touch. First of all, I'm going to lower this sample. I want to get a bit more hat information in there. Open hats. Maybe a bit more snare bottom. And secondary rim. I'm liking the sound of that. Now let's move over to the drums bus. Just making sure that we're still getting a nice under 6 dB peak for all of our drums accumulated. Now we can start to think about panning this around. Most of the tracks, as you can see, have already been panned as they've been bounced out as stereo files. However, there is some more movement we can gain to these. A good rule of thumb here is to make sure everything is balanced. So if you move something left, make sure there's something on the right to complement it. I'm going to play through again and do most of this control with the high frequency information. So the hi-hats around this area and maybe the percussion parts here. Let's have a listen and work our way through it. Now that slight difference that we've done there with the closed hat and the open hat gives a bit more focus to the other percussive parts. Moving those hats out the way now give us the option to hear these other percussive parts and the highs from this filtered break a little bit clearer. Now these drums sound pretty nice. Let's bring in the bass with them. I do want a little bit more punch to those drums. However, I don't want to ruin the sound that I've already got on my drum bus. A good way to get this to happen is to add in some parallel compression. Now, as you can see over here, I have an 1176 on my New York compression bus. If I open this plugin up, you'll see that the settings are fairly moderate. I'm going to come over to my drum bus, send it to the New York bus, and slowly feed in the signal until I get my desired sound. As you can hear from that, we're getting so much more power. What I can do now is send this New York bus, even though it's going to the sends, which automatically send to my submix, I'm going to send this to mix A. This is because this is where all of my drum information is going to go. So my drum output and my parallel drum sound is going to be going through my summing processing. I'm going to adjust the gain of the output of this. So now it's not as drastic, but it's definitely more exciting. Making sure I'm always going back and checking the volume is so important here. So again, let's go back and check our overall volumes in terms of our mix bus process.
Can follow me.
So we're getting there. There's definitely some work that can be done on the kick. Now I could do this on the kick itself by adding in some equalization, or I could do it on the drum bus or on my summing mix. This is one of the beauties of having a template like this. It gives me loads of options of where I can add in processing, but also keeps it extremely efficient and easy to view. Let's try it on the track itself. So I'm going to come to the track. I'm going to open up the FabFilter Pro Q3. Let's listen to this in solo and see the information that we're going to get. So I can see the fundamental frequencies here for the kick. It's also got some nice top end to it. So let's work with these frequencies. I'm going to tighten up this frequency here. We're working at about 60 Hertz. To tighten this up even more, I'm going to lower the very low end. Let's have a high decibel per octave here, just so it's a nice steep cut. Cut this at about 30. It's a good idea now to get rid of some of that low mid-range. Around 260 sounds nice, maybe a touch wider. And always go back and listen before and after. As you can hear now, it's got so much more punch to it. Let's listen to this with the rest of the drums and the rest of the track.
Can follow me.
So that's sounding a little bit nicer now. Let's move on before we make any drastic changes to the next most important thing in the track. Remember, I don't want to do too much to each single element right now, or even on the groups right now. I want to make sure everything works well together. So let's see how the drums are going to work with the bass. The first thing I noticed when listening to the reference was our first mid bass was mono. So let's have a listen to that again and see what we can do to get that a little bit wider. See, the texture of this sound is really nice. It's got some movement, it's got some modulation. However, it is dead down the center. There's a few different things you can do here to make this a bit wider and give a bit more character to the overall sound. One of these is something I can set up nice and quick because of the template. If you remember, in this template, I have a modulation bus, which has a chorus plugin on it. This chorus plugin is an emulation of the chorus from the Juno 106 classic synth keyboard. I'm going to add this as a send effect. Come down to our modulation bus, slowly bleed this in, and listen to the difference we're going to get. So without. Now I really like the sound of this, and the best part about it is the original sound is untouched. The original sound is still mono. We're just making a copy of this that has some modulation on it. So let's listen to it with the rest of the basses. That sounds so much nicer now. Let's take the sub out and listen to the relationship between the two mid basses. Because we have sub in here, I'm going to open up an EQ. This one can just be the standard channel strip and take out a lot of those low frequencies that will be taken up with our sub. I'm going to pick from 70 Hz down, drag this over to the other mid bass track, and now think about what we can do to this track to give it a bit more width and excitement. One of the main things in the notes was ambience. They wanted an ambient liquid mix. This at the moment is nowhere near ambient as it's extremely dry. One of the best things we can add in for ambience is reverb. And one of our reverb effects here is a standard plate reverb. This is going to work really nice to exaggerate those whips in the filter opening. So I'm going to come over to the track, send this to my reverb 1, and bleed into taste. Maybe a bit more. I can hear now that that is exaggerating the lower frequencies and the low mid frequencies, so I can come to the reverb itself and cut more of the low frequencies out. The timing's okay, around 5 seconds. It's got a nice smooth tail to it. So let's listen to this now in comparison, in relation to the rest of the track.
Can follow me.
As you can see now, we've got so much more width to the track in terms of our mid basses. Let's go back and check our reference.
You can follow me.
Okay, so the drum and bass relationship is slowly getting there. Let's mute everything but the drums and bass and see what we're working with there as a pair. The sub could definitely do with some work, mainly due to the fact that each of the notes are different volumes. First of all, let's go in and see if we can manage this change in volume consistency. One plugin I like to use for this, especially on subs, is the Pro Limiter. This is an Avid plugin and it gives you some really nice control over your limiting characteristics. First of all, let's bring the threshold down so we're definitely in limiting. I'm going to pull the output ceiling down to 1 decibel. As you can hear already, we're starting to get some form of clipping artifacts. I can add some character here and have our overall output brought down in volume. I'm going to bring our volume fader down. As I bring this in, you can hear the intensity of that sub so much more. What I might do before this limiter is just exaggerate those lower frequencies. So I'm going to take the same EQ that I had. So I'm going to add in another channel EQ here. But instead of getting rid of the bass, I'm going to lift some of that bass in our sub area. Fairly tight Q. And get rid of some of the higher frequencies. Not too many though, as there are some harmonics there that I can hear that sound quite nice. So now we've got so much more consistency in our drums. The next thing we can do is think about sidechain compression. I want to make sure that every time that kick hits, it is not masked by this bass information. It's not bad at the moment, but it could definitely get a little bit more movement in it. To do this, I'm going to set this up from the kick. So from the kick drum, I'm going to send this out to an open bus. We're going to pick bus 31 and 32. In order to make sure that I can read what this is going to be easily from a list, I can right click on it and rename this. I'm going to call this sidechain. This is going to be sent 100%. Now, all this is doing is sending. We haven't set up an output bus for this. So where we're sending it to, we're not going to hear a double. All it is sending some signal. Let's have a look at this in action. Now all we need to do on our bass bus is come along, add in a compressor, and make sure that we have the key input set to the sidechain. To do this, I'm going to use the FabFilter Pro C2. This has an excellent sidechain function. At the moment, it's set to external. I need to come up to my key input, find my sidechain bus, either left or right as it's a mono signal. And now I can adjust my parameters to dial in the correct amount of compression. That's pretty nice there. However, we can see here it's taking all of the frequencies from those kicks. What I can utilize here is my EQ sidechain. This means that only the frequencies that I have within a range of our curve are going to be affecting the sidechain. All of the high frequencies now are not going to be triggering those pulls, just the low frequencies. This is now going to determine what the curve looks like in direct relation to our attack and release. So let's play it now. Again, let's go back and listen to everything together.
Can follow me.
You can already hear we're getting so much more warmth out of this track with minimal processing.
You can follow me.
So now we've got to a nice place for the drums and the bass. It's not finished, but it's kind of there. Let's move to the next most important thing, the vocals. Now these vocal parts start from the first verse. What we need to do is establish the kind of effects that we need in these in order to make them stand out for the mix and become ambient. Again, other than the drums and the bass, this is the main focal point of the track. So this needs to be really important and dominant. Let's have a listen and see what we can think.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
Okay, there's some obvious things in there that we can add in, namely reverb and delay. To do this, I'm just going to drag up my vocal output bus just underneath the vocals, and then do most of my processing on here. The only changes I'm going to make on the track itself is some possible EQ and some volume changes. The volume's pretty good so far, so I'm just going to look at the EQ. I'm going to come up to the Pro Q3 for this, just to give me a better visual representation of the frequencies present.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
Just listening to that first listen, a nice boost at around about 5,000 brings out the air a bit
I
more.
will show you the place I belong.
I'm going to add an additional lift at around about 12k for some air.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us.
That's kind of nice there, not too much. I can see that there's a lot of low frequency been taken out already.
In the water, reflections of the moon.
However, I'm still going to take some more out, just to make sure there's no bleed really low
You
down.
can follow me.
Okay, we got the EQ, we got the volume sorted. Next, we're going to think about the reverbs and delays. The first reverb slot, the first send slot for our vocals, I'm going to send to the plate reverb, which was verb 1, and lead this in to taste.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
That's pretty nice. Let's listen to it in the context with the rest of the track.
I will show you the place I belong.
I think we're in the right area.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us.
That's kind of nice, but it also needs a bit of delay. I do have a selection of delays here. I have both Echo Boy Juniors, but one is set to quarter note and another is set to half note. I'm going to use my second delay here, put the time up to whole note, make sure it's on wide mode, and take away some of the high frequencies. Doing this means that I'm not going to get much of those S's and higher frequency information in the delay tabs. Also, taking out some of the low frequencies may get rid of any possible plosives within the vocal that are then going to be delayed. We'll do the same thing here. We'll go to the vocal bus and we'll add in some of this to taste.
You can follow me down to the ocean. I will show you the place I belong.
That's kind of nice there. However, it is getting in the way of the first words within each of those phrases. The other thing that's happening is that because we're sending a dry vocal to this delay, there's no reverb surrounding those delay tabs. The only reverb we've set up is on its own separate bus. A good way to counteract this and to get a little bit more flavour into those delays is to send that delay back out and into another reverb. For this, I'm going to use the Black Hole. This is a plugin by Eventide, and unlike the plate reverb, it's got a lot more creative character to it. Let's send this in and see what we can get from it.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
As you can hear there, those tails, you've now got so much more space and movement around those tails. What I can do just underneath this reverb is add in another channel strip just to get rid of some of those lower frequencies and higher frequencies. Remember, this is only adding EQ curve to the output of this reverb.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
So listen to the vocals on their own.
I will show you the place I belong.
So now as you can hear, those echoes have a lot more character to them and they flow out with a bit more ambience. The only problem is, as mentioned before, every so often, the delay is starting straight away. I don't want this to happen. Now, there's a few ways that we can change this. We can duplicate the track over and just put the parts of audio that we want to be delayed on the track that has the send information, or we can duplicate the track over and just have a section of it that we want to be delayed within that track, or we can do this with automation. I'm going to do this the automation way. What we need to do is come down to our automation lane of our output bus, pick the delay, and we're going to pick the muting function. What this means is I'm going to be able to mute the send. If I zoom in here, I'll be able to determine exactly when the send is open. So for all of this section here, I want all of this section to be muted, but only come in and send this part of the vocal in to get delay. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
So all I'm getting there is the ocean rather than all of these lyrics. Let's work through and do the same thing. So again here, let's take all of this out and then just have the last words in the sentence thrown into some delay.
I will show you the place I belong.
Let's work through the track.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us.
This one was a little bit too late, so let's drag that in. See what this sounds like here.
Darkness surrounds us.
And again here.
In the water, reflections of. In the water, reflections of the moon.
I'd quite like that to be on the moon rather than just the word moon. So let's see what this sounds like.
Reflections of the moon. You can follow me.
Now the next thing I want to do is send a little bit more of this vocal to that delay for this section as it bleeds into the break. In order to do this, I can open up a new track of automation and pick, instead of the mute, the level. Let's open this up a little bit more. And from this point on, let's zoom in to where we want it to come from.
You can follow.
So I'd like it to be from the word follow me. So where it says follow me, I'm going to drag all of these parts and just slowly bring those up.
You can follow me.
As you can see now, it rings out so much more. We'll do the same again here. An easy way to get this done is to snap to bar, take a full section, Command and C for copy, click a bar early, Command V for paste. Again here. So now we have the exact same automation for all of those lead words.
You can follow me.
I may pull these down a touch more. I can see from the vocals here that all of this information is the same in the second half. So what I can do is the same thing I did with the automation for our level. I can select a full range. I can copy that. And then I can go ahead and paste that again from the same spot. So now we'll have the exact same mutes for the second half as we do in the first. I do the same for this section, for the levels. Let's have a listen now.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
After listening to this and listening to the full lyric, I do think it could do with some compression. This isn't really to adjust any kind of consistency with the volume, because the only inconsistency is this little plosive here. What I'm going to do is add a compressor that's going to give me some form of character. I'm going to do this on the output bus, and I'm going to pick a LA2A. This is a universal audio plugin again, and this is excellent for adding character, warmth and tone to any source material. I'm going to slowly adjust the peak reduction. The higher the peak reduction, the more the compression happens. And then we have an output gain here. Let's have a listen and adjust the taste.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
Bypass this for the next one.
I will show you the place I belong.
So the difference in those vocals now, they're so much more forward in the mix, they're warmer, they have a texture to them, and it just generally sounds like a finished vocal. Also having this on the track itself for the output means that I'm sending that warmer, thicker tone to these delays and these reverbs, which gives a thicker and warmer tone to the effects. Let's fold down these automation lanes because they're done for this track now. Bring our vocal track back down to where it was and have a listen through and see what we can do with our instrumentation.
You can follow me.
So instantly those pianos could definitely have a bit more character to them. I'm going to adjust the volume for these on the instrument output.
You can follow me.
Once I solo those pianos, the chords, you can hear a lot of low, mid frequency information, which is clouding that mix. I'm going to open up an EQ, again, the Pro Q3, as it's got a great analysis point, and look at where those frequencies are and try and eradicate them slightly. So much softer now. I'm going to give it a bit more top end. So much clearer in the mix. Let's get rid of that low information with a low cut at a high decibel per octave. Let's bring in those melodies. Same EQ. Maybe less around here as that was quite resonant. Let's go back and make sure we're around a section that has those other piano parts in. It's fairly nice. Those pianos could still do with a bit more warmth and ambience. I'm going to do this by adding in the second reverb. Now remember, this reverb at the moment is only being used to add effect to the delays for the vocals. I'm going to add in a slight amount of this into those pianos just to give them a bit of ambience and then help fade out with those vocal delays.
Follow me.
Now those high notes on the piano are a little bit too drastic. I don't necessarily want to turn them down that much, I just want to soften them a bit. Now I'm going to do this through compression. And a really good compressor for this, again, is the LA2, as it's nice, warm and rounded. I'm going to drag this compressor over and see what we can get just from that, concentrating on those last notes. Let's zoom in and get a loop going around that last section. Bit more compression there. That's a bit more manageable, but what we can do is just come to this last section here and do this manually by bringing it down a decibel. Maybe more. Let's try 2. There we go, that's much more manageable. Let's see where else this happens in the track. I can see it here. And again, later on. So that's the piano balance, kind of there. Again, we don't want to do too much here because the track sounded okay to start with. All we're doing is sweetening it up and making it a little bit warmer and a little bit clearer. Most of the work for these types of tracks are done within the production. All we're doing is making it sound as nice as it can and get it ready for mastering. The next instrument to work with is the pads and the strings. Let's have a listen to these from instrument 2 and see what we're working with. First of all, let's listen to the main pad on its own. It's fairly nicely treated as it is. Let's listen to the strings. So together they do work quite well already. Let's listen further on, because from this section, the strings go up a register. I'm going to get an EQ for these strings and open up that top end a bit. Only slight. And let's listen to it for the rest of the track. Any more processing is going to be done on the overall output track for these on instrument 2. Let's move on to instrument 3, which is the organs, because at the moment they are really starting to drown out. Let's see what we can get with these with just some volume. Again, some EQ. Let's pull out some of that low range. Go from the start of this drop. I'm going to add some compression to this just to get a little bit more consistency and dynamic range closure from the highest point to the lowest point. As if we look at these, because if we look at these, the peak to start with is a lot higher than the tail. A good compressor for this is the 1176. I'm going to find this in my list here. And I'm going to pick the Legacy stereo version of the 1176 LN. Let's see what we can get from this with some fairly fast and fairly long compression. Maybe a bit less on the input. Bit more volume on the output. It's so much more consistent in its volume now, so I can afford to bring it down around a decibel. Let's go back and listen to this drop in terms of the reference. So overall, the majority of the time we are staying within that -6 range. So the volume sounds a lot louder on the mix, and it's a lot wider, warmer, thicker, and generally more exciting than the reference, which is hopefully where we want to be at this stage. Any more processing that needs to be done here, we can always go back and change what needs to be changed. At this stage, I'm fairly happy with the mix. The only things that I really need to look at now is the mix bus processes. At the moment, there is nothing on the mix bus but this safety net limiter, which we'll come to a bit later. What I want to do is EQ the mix as a whole. I'm going to come over here and pick the Pro Q3 again. Here I'm going to perform more surgical EQ than creative EQ, mainly looking at the areas that need to be lifted and the areas that need to be subtracted, but doing it whilst listening to the track as a whole. This is as close as you're going to get to the mastering stage when you're in a mix stage. You need to make sure that the track sounds as clean as it can possibly be in order to be sent for mastering. So let's have a listen from the drop and see what we're working with. That sounds pretty nice there, just exaggerating that bass line slightly. One other thing that I have forgotten from this mix is dealing with these transitions. So far, it's quite abrupt, leading in and leading out. All we've concentrated on is the sonic qualities of each of the elements. But in the notes, they did mention that they wanted some transitions.
You can follow me.
Adding in those vocal delays has worked well going in. However, coming out of those transitions, we can definitely employ some more techniques. Let's look at the filtering for these drums.
Follow me.
This might sound nicer if we come in a little bit smoother rather than abruptly coming in with these. And a good way to do this is just with a simple EQ filter. To do this, I'm going to come down to my drums. I'm going to open up my automation lanes. And on these drums here, I'm going to put a channel strip EQ. Now this isn't going to be doing anything at all until I decide to automate it. What I need to do in this is turn on both filters, the high pass and the low pass. I'm going to come to my automations here. select filter 1 frequency and filter 2 frequency and add these to my available automation lanes. Now what I can do is, with automation, slowly build in the track in terms of its frequency information. Open the automation lanes here. We'll now be able to choose from this list the filter 1 frequency and the filter 2 frequency. So let's have a look which one's what. So the low frequency cut is filter 1 and the high frequency cut is filter 2. Because this is all high frequency information, I'm going to start with a high frequency cut. So let's pick this from the list. Filter 2 frequency. I want to slowly get up to open. Open up the lane a bit more. And what we're going to do here is start lower. Let's have a listen to what this sounds like.
Follow me. Follow me.
Okay, what I can do is make this end a little bit lower before it hits and opens fully.
You can follow me.
Okay, that also gives me another idea. What I'm going to do is open this fully and then drag this down, back down again, whilst also adding in some reverb. Now again, on the drum bus, this is where I'm going to add this in. I'm going to send this to reverb 1. I'm going to pick reverb 1 as a new automation lane in terms of the level. At the moment, it's set to 0, so there's going to be no reverb happening whatsoever. I'm going to make this swift change across here. So as our filter opens, the reverb gets sent and then slowly decays out again.
Follow me.
I'm going to filter that back down to almost nothing towards the end and listen again. This may take some time, but it's definitely worth it.
Follow me. You can follow me.
I might have this reverb still quite high up to this point.
You can follow me.
Okay, cool. Let's listen to the next section.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us.
This would be a good place to start to add in a little bit more automation here and slowly filter this out.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us. In the water, reflections of the moon. Alone here, the darkness surrounds us.
Slowly bleed in that reverb again.
In the water, reflections of the moon. You can
Again, this could be tedious, but it's definitely worth it.
In the water, reflections of the moon. You can follow me.
As you can see here, the automation is still working before the drop. Obviously, that's not ideal. So let's move this back and make sure that our EQ is fully open just before the drop starts.
You can follow me.
Let's look towards the end and do the same sort of thing. And lastly, let's get rid of that click towards the end. Sounds like it's coming from the drums. And I can see that just at the end here. Put a slight fade in, make sure that everything ends smoothly. Now we can go back and visit the mix bus. So we've got a nice EQ. The next thing we can think about, instead of putting something on like compression, is some saturation. A great plugin for this is the T-Rax X Saturator. This plugin gives you the option to have loads of different styles of saturation. We have tape saturation, mastering, tube saturation, solid state, and transformer style emulations. I'm going to go for the iron and drive, unlink the input to the output, and see what we can get in terms of characteristics. Let's go to the drop section of the track. Let's go to the drop section of the track. This is really going to give us that warmth that we need.
You can follow me.
It still sounds a little bit dull, mainly in those drums. So on my drum summing stack here, I'm going to pick something called the Helios EQ. This is another UAD plugin, and I'm going to pick the legacy version. The reason I'm using this is because it's a very straightforward EQ. You've got specific frequencies to choose from and volumes of which you can add them in. I'm going to add in 60 decibels here by 3 dB, and I'm also going to look at the upper mid-range just to get a bit more snap in those percussive elements.
You can follow me.
What I'm going to do now is slowly pull back on that output just to compensate for that gain that we've added whilst pushing in more drum information. Listening back to these basses now, the basses aren't really cutting through the mix that well. The sub is okay, we'll bring that back up to 0. But this main mid bass, it's not really cutting through the mix. Instead of adding distortion to this, I'm going to add a preamp emulation. For this, I'm going to choose the UAD Neve preamp. I'm going to set this to the mic setting. I'm going to turn the volume all the way down and slowly bleed in some drive. Already hear that cutting through the mix. Let's listen to that on its own just so you can see what we're adding. So without, and then without, just so much more power. Obviously we're adding some gain, but it's that grit that we get on top that makes it cut through the mix. Maybe pull back on the volume. Lift those instruments up a touch. So right, let's go from the first verse and see what we're working with now as a full mix.
You can follow me down to the ocean. I will show you the place I belong.
Add some high EQ to these vocals on the bass. Remember, this isn't to the effects.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us. In the water, reflections of the moon. You can follow me.
Add a bit more gain here to that bass bus. Going through the mic here really does add so much more character to the sound instead of using the line.
You can follow me.
May add a bit more wood.
You can follow me.
Pull back on that once the sub comes in. Listen to the bass without this channel strip. What I might do here is just change the setting for this bass because it's not really working as nice as it could for the rest of the track. So let's try it with the line instead. Bit of EQ. I might take some of the low mid frequency out here. Around about 250 to 300 on a fairly tight cue. It's a little bit nicer. Let's bring them all back in.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
One last thing I'm going to do is to those vocals. I'm going to add in a bit more width to them using that modulation bus. I'm going to go to the verse just to show how this works.
You can follow me down to the ocean.
It's a lot nicer.
I will show you the place I belong.
Just adds an extra width to those vocals.
Alone here, the darkness surrounds us.
So at this point, I'd say that this mix is pretty much ready for mastering. Let's select all of our tracks. Make sure that we've got a good selection. All of the tracks are well balanced. And let's look at how we're going to bounce this out. So first of all, we wanted to make sure that the mix was around about the same volume as the reference. We've pretty much nailed that. Let's just double check. Let's go to the loudest part of the mix again.
You can follow me.
Let's pull our overall output down. It's quite quiet now, a bit more.
You can follow me.
And again, listen to this one.
You can follow me.
So we're looking at about the -5 mark there. Let's check ours.
You can follow me. You can follow me.
Okay, so we've got a nice mix balance there. Now if we go back and refer to the notes from the mix, let's make sure we've ticked off all the things that have been asked for. The client asked if we could add our own reverbs and delays, which we've done, where we see fit in order to create an ambient liquid mix that sounds warm. They've also provided a reference track for an indication as to level and add in transition effects like filtering and fading. We've done all these things. We've tried to adhere to what the standard of the mix was before, but just making it warmer, more ambient, and a little bit clearer. This is now ready to send for mastering. Hopefully you can see from this process there's not a lot that we have done around each of the tracks. Getting most of the processing done towards the end of the session means we can use processors that are fairly heavy, like the UAD plugins, and heavy-duty compressors and effects, and still keep efficiency and still keep CPU down, whilst also working really efficiently. This mix has been done in just under 2 hours. There may be notes that come back with revisions for each mix, but this is okay. At least this way we're in the right ballpark and we're getting the track done to how we think it sounds good. If there's any revisions at this point, we can easily go back and rectify what needs to be done, as there's not much processing that's going on, and it's basic balance, slight pan, EQs, compression, and some send effects. Most of the tone is coming from our output faders here, or our summing faders. Hopefully this has given a really good insight into one way of mixing a track efficiently, creatively, and hopefully successfully.